I want to begin by thanking Horacio and Eduardo and Sergio and all the other wonderful people here for being such wonderful hosts. I have been thinking about an extension of some of the things that have been talked about by some of the previous speakers, including Ayan just now, about how law and economics insights can be applied to the very important task of fostering economic growth and development. I'm going to try to give you, in what follows here, a very quick overview of what modern economic growth is like, a quick summary of some of the theories about why some countries prosper and others don't, and then to try to give you an assessment of the role of law in fostering economic growth and development. As you will see, my conclusion really has two parts. The first part is that it is surprising how little we know about the process of economic growth and development. Secondly, it's disturbing to see how little a role good law, has in fostering economic growth and development. So let me try to explain to you what I'm talking about here. Let me begin with a broad overview of modern economic growth. Modern economic growth is not that old. It's about 200 years old. It began in Northern Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, around 1820. That's the date that the great student who just died in April, Angus Maddison, gives for the beginning of modern economic growth. Modern economic growth is to be distinguished from past episodes of growth in the following several ways. Past episodes of growth were episodic. They didn't last very long, and there was an increase and then a sharp decrease. Those past episodes of growth typically occurred because of conquest of another people and the exploitation of those people and of their natural resources. By contrast, modern economic growth does not require the exploitation of other peoples or of their resources. It's based principally on technological improvement and is sustained and seems to last a long time. Now, I recognize that saying it seems to last a long time avoids a question. All we know is that modern economic growth began about 200 years ago and appears to have, in the countries in which it began, to have continued for the last 200 years. We don't know what's going to happen 100 years from today or 200 years from today. Perhaps 200 years from today, somebody will be standing here speaking perhaps in English about the decline of the United States and of the Northern Hemisphere countries. But let us assume that modern economic growth has these distinct characteristics of being non-exploitive and sustained. In the countries that developed first, the ones in Northern Europe, annual gross domestic product per capita, per person, has increased by a factor of 50 in the last 200 years. Today, the wealthiest countries in the world, including the United States, have an annual gross domestic product per capita of close to $50,000. Let me try to indicate to you how much that is. $50,000 per person for the 310 million people in the United States translates roughly into a gross domestic product of about $15 trillion. That is, the value of all goods and services produced in the United States in a good year is about $15 trillion. That amounts to approximately 1/3 of the total world gross domestic product. Every man, woman, and child in the United States has a claim on approximately $50,000 per year. So for a family of 4, the average income is $200,000 per year. That is wealth beyond the wildest dreams of the richest people of 200 years ago. In 1820, this is another important fact about modern growth. In 1820, the richest country, the United Kingdom, was approximately 4 times wealthier than the poorest parts of the world, Africa. Today, the difference between the wealthiest and the poorest is on the order of 100 to 1. So the rich have been getting richer far faster than the poor have been getting richer in the world. What are the causes of modern sustained growth? The principal cause is the increase in total factor productivity. That's a term of art in economics that refers to the output per unit of all inputs. Those improvements in total factor productivity have come principally from the 4 factors you see here: improvements in the organization of resources in productive units, improvements in the efficiency of markets, technological change, and improvements in the efficiency with which governmental services are delivered. And very importantly, these modern economic growth figures have not been sustained or caused by conquest and enslavement. A quick word about the ranges of development. The world has principally 3 different ranges of well-being and stages of growth that scholars of economic growth and development divide the world into. The most developed countries have an annual gross domestic product per capita of $20,000 per year or more. And there are approximately 1 billion of the 6.5 billion people on the planet who fall into this category. Most of them are in North America, Western Europe, and Japan. The second group of division in the world are the mid-level countries, the countries who have been developing for a relatively long time. They have an annual gross domestic per capita of between $1,000 and $20,000, a broad range. And there are approximately 4.5 billion people in this broad category. The last and the poorest division of well-being in the world are the bottom billion, as the economist Paul Collier calls them. The poorest people have an annual gross domestic product per capita of less than $1,000 per year. Typically in the literature, $1,000 per person per year is referred to as a $2 per day level of poverty. And approximately 1 billion people live under those conditions. The very poor people are principally concentrated in certain identifiable places in the world. They are not scattered around the world like raisins in a fruitcake. They are concentrated. 70% of them live in sub-Saharan Africa. But not all of the people in sub-Saharan Africa are among the poorest in the world. For example, the country of Botswana is one of the great success stories in economic growth and development. The other 30% of the poorest 1 billion people in the world are scattered through the 22 Arab-speaking countries that stretch from Morocco to Iraq and in the Central Asian republics that used to be part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. There are two groups within this category of very poor people. The very, very poor who live on $1 per day or less, that's an annual income of approximately $500, and the not quite so poor who live on $2 per day, an annual income of approximately $1,000. The United Nations, under the pressure of the economist Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University, adopted something called the Millennium Development Goals in 2001. One of the most important of those goals was to reduce the number of people who live in this category of extremely poor people by half by the year 2015. Happily, we've already met that goal. The number of people who live under these horrible conditions has been falling extremely rapidly. In fact, since 1980, we've had the largest reduction in very, very poor people in the history of the human race. One of the great successes of modern history is our success in relieving the horrible poverty of a large number of people. That's the good news. The somewhat nuanced bad news is that the reason for this dramatic decline in the number of very poor people is the extraordinary growth record of India and China. India and China together comprise 40% of the world's population. So things that happen in those countries have an outsized impact on world statistics. So the rapid increase in the Chinese and Indian economies, in the case of China since 1980, in the case of India since 1991 or so, has had a tremendously beneficial impact on the number of poor in the world. Why are some countries wealthy and others poor? Well, I'm not going to elaborate on these conditions, but these three things, different climates, different endowments of natural resources, and different cultures have been among the most prominent theories that have been propounded since modern economic growth began approximately 200 years ago. The thing I want to point out to you about these three principal theories, if they're theories, about why some countries are rich and others are poor, is that they don't offer much in the way of public policy correctives. If your climate is not conducive to growth, there's not a lot you can do about that. You can't manufacture a better climate. You can move to a better climate, and of course human beings have done that over the course of millions of years. How about different endowments of natural resources? There's a little bit more that we can do about that, because it turns out that natural resources vary in their value, and that new technological change tends to produce new natural resources that people thought were not useful. The most obvious example of that is coal. Coal was an annoyance until the price of wood went sky high, the principal heating material, and people began to search for alternatives. Coal was the most obvious alternative, except it was difficult to get out of the ground because of the flooding in the mines. Fortunately, a man named Watt invented a very inexpensive machine to pump water out of the coal mines, and you and I are here speaking and using technology as a result. The last thing I want to say in this review of modern economic growth is that there's now a modern view of economic growth and development that I want to bring your attention to. And it's not that some countries are bound to be wealthy and other countries are bound to be poor. The more modern view is that there is nothing that distinguishes the rich and the poor other than the time at which they began the process of modern economic growth. The UK and the Netherlands were first, then came the United States and Canada, and so on and so forth. The modern view is that Africa, even sub-Saharan Africa, the home of 70% of the poorest people on the planet, has finally begun the process of sustained modern economic growth. Growth rates in sub-Saharan Africa since 2004 have been among the highest in the world. Deng Xiaoping, one of my favorite political philosophers, captured this as he captured many other marvelous things about societies by saying, when he tried to persuade the Chinese people to join him in his growth-enhancing policies, all will be rich, some will be first. Modern economic growth, the happy news is a process open to all. It is not a process that only a certain fraction of the planet can participate in. Now, there are limits on modern economic growth. There are limits imposed by population and by global warming, which I think I'm not going to be around to see the direst aspects of that, but it is a horrible problem that's going to take a concerted amount of collective action on the part of all of the nations of the world to address. But I don't want to tarry on that. I want to turn instead to a very quick summary of some of the theories of modern economic growth in order to get to the question that I've posed about what role does law play in modern economic growth. One of the first theories propounded to explain why some nations are wealthy and others are not was that there were cultures that were conducive to economic growth and other cultures that were not. For example, it is a demonstrable fact that around the world, the countries that appear to be doing the best have some sort